My name is Lena. I am 42 years old. For nearly 2 decades, my life was a silent nightmare, an echo of suffering that no one else could hear. I was sold into slavery to a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, a place where my dreams and my identity vanished like sand in the desert. But in my darkest moment, when hope was only a distant memory, an unexpected light found its way to me, a light that came from a prohibited book. This is my story of how Jesus rescued me from a life of servitude and restored the freedom I thought I had lost forever. I was born in a small, humble village in the province of Mindanao in the Philippines. My world was a symphony of green rice fields and the sound of children playing on the dirt streets. We were poor, very poor, but rich in community and in faith. My grandmother taught us to pray, to trust in a God who, according to her, looked after the least of us. I dreamed of a better life, not for myself, but for my parents and younger siblings. I wanted to see them with enough food on the table, with a roof that didn't leak during the monsoon season. That yearning to provide for them was the seed that led me to make a decision that would alter the course of my existence in a way I could never have imagined. A los 23, una agencia de reclutamiento llegó a nuestro pueblo prometiendo el paraíso, un trabajo bien pagado como empleada doméstica en la deslumbrante ciudad de Dubái. The photographs they showed were of skyscrapers scraping the sky and smiling families. They promised a good salary, 1 day off a week, and the chance to send money home. For a young woman like me, it was the golden ticket, the answer to all our prayers. My parents cried as they waved goodbye at the airport. Their tears were a mixture of pride and fear. I promised them everything would be fine, that I would return soon to build them a new house. I had no idea that it would take nearly 20 years before I could even begin to fulfill that promise. The plane landed, but not in the glittering Dubai. It landed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The heat hit me like a wall as I stepped off the plane, but it was the coldness in the eyes of the man who met me that chilled my soul. Él se robó mi pasaporte con un movimiento brusco y me metió en un coche con ventanillas tintadas. En ese instante me di cuenta de que había caído en una trampa. I was not an employee. I was property. I was sold to an upper-class Saudi family whose power and wealth were matched only by their cruelty. My new life began in a sprawling villa of marble and gold, but for me, it was a golden cage. Work shifts lasted 18, sometimes 20 hours. They began before dawn and ended long after the family had gone to sleep. I slept on the floor of a small storage closet, a windowless space that smelled of cleaning products and despair. Food consisted of the scraps they allowed me to take from their plates if there was anything left. Abuse was my daily bread. The matriarch of the house, a woman named Amal, found sadistic pleasure in humiliating me. She would scream at me for the slightest imperfection, calling me stupid, dirty, and infidel. Sometimes her anger would overflow into physical violence, a slap for a broken dish, a push down the stairs for not moving fast enough. Her husband was an indifferent businessman who barely noticed my existence, and their children, raised in that toxic environment, treated me like a toy they could break at will. They took my phone. They forbade me from speaking to the other servants. All contact with the outside world was cut off. My family in the Philippines knew nothing of me. To them, I simply vanished. The years began to merge into one long, monotonous nightmare. I lost track of time, of who I was. The Lena who dreamed and laughed was buried under layers of fear and exhaustion. The Catholic faith of my childhood, with its rituals and memorized prayers, felt like a distant echo of another life. Where was that God my grandmother had told me about? How could he allow so much suffering? In my solitude, I began to believe he had completely abandoned me. The Islamic call to prayer sounded 5 times a day from the nearby minarets, a constant reminder that I was in a strange land under a God who was not mine and who considered me inferior. The spiritual void inside me was an abyss as deep and dark as the closet in which I slept. I had lost all hope of ever seeing my family again, of ever being free. Slavery not only chains the body, it also poisons the soul until you convince yourself that you deserve nothing more. If you have found value in this story so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing testimonies of hope that need to be heard around the world. 15 largos años pasaron. Mi cuerpo constantemente me dolía, y mi espíritu estaba casi completamente roto. Un día, la familia decidió mudarse a una villa aún más grande y más opulenta en otra parte de la ciudad. My task was to clean and empty the old house, including a dusty basement that hadn't been opened in years. It was a damp, dark place, full of old furniture and forgotten boxes. As I moved a heavy stack of old carpets, I discovered an antique-looking suitcase covered in a thick layer of dust. Curiosity, a feeling I thought was dead in me, compelled me to open it. Inside, among tattered clothes and personal items of someone who had surely worked there long before me, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a small, worn paperback book. It was written in Tagalog, my mother tongue, and on the cover, in simple letters, it read, Ang Banal na Biblia, the Holy Bible. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew the danger that book represented in this country. Possessing a Bible was a serious crime, an act that could lead to jail, deportation, or even worse. My first instinct was to close it again, hide it, pretend I had never seen it. But something, a force I cannot describe, compelled me to take it. It was as if my hands had a will of their own. I hid the little book under my uniform, and that night, in the suffocating darkness of my closet, I waited for absolute silence to take hold of the house. I had found an old cell phone with a cracked screen that one of the children had thrown away. Over several weeks, I had managed to charge it secretly. Using the dim light of that cracked screen, I opened the Bible. My hands trembled. I didn't know where to start, so I simply opened it to a random page. My eyes fell on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Tears began to stream from my eyes, silent and hot. They rolled down my cheeks and fell onto the page, weary, burdened. Those words didn't just describe me, they were the definition of my existence. I kept reading, night after night, in secret. I devoured the stories of Jesus. This Jesus was not a distant, severe prophet. He was a man who touched lepers, who ate with sinners, who defended women, and who loved the poor. He spoke of a God who was a loving father, a God who counted every hair on my head, a God who loved me, Lena, the forgotten slave. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel alone in my closet. I felt a presence with me, a warmth that began to melt the ice that had formed around my heart. The Bible became my lifeline. The words of the scriptures were the only nourishment my soul had received in over a decade. I clung to them with the desperation of a shipwrecked survivor. Algo dentro de mí comenzó a cambiar. El odio y el resentimiento que sentía hacia mis captores comenzaron a disiparse, reemplazados por un extraño sentido de paz. I began to pray, not for my liberation, but for them. I asked Jesus to soften their hearts. My behavior changed. I no longer walked with my head bowed, avoiding eye contact. Although I was still a servant, there was a new dignity in my posture, a light in my eyes that I couldn't hide. Amal, the lady of the house, was the first to notice. My new serenity bewildered and somehow enraged her. She couldn't understand why her insults no longer made me cry, why her threats seemed to bounce off an invisible shield. She escalated her cruelty, looking for a crack in my new armor, trying to provoke the reaction of fear and submission she was accustomed to. But the more she pressured me, the more I clung to the promises I read every night in my secret book. One afternoon, I made an insignificant mistake. I spilled a little tea on an expensive rug. Amal's fury was volcanic. She screamed at me, slapped me, and, in a fit of rage, ran to my small closet, saying she would throw away my miserable possessions. She ripped my few clothes from the hook, threw my thin blanket to the floor, and then she saw it. The small Bible in Tagalog was tucked among my folded clothes. The silence that followed was more terrifying than her screams. She picked it up as if it were a venomous snake, her face contorted into a mask of hatred and disgust. "What is this filth?" she hissed, waving the book in my face. "You are a Christian. You have brought the dirt of your demonic faith into my house." She dragged me by the hair to the main living room, where her husband was reading the newspaper. She threw the book at his feet. "Our slave is a cross worshiper. She has been contaminating our home." The husband looked at me with a coldness that paralyzed me. He slowly stood up and walked toward me. "You have a choice," he said in a dangerously quiet voice. "Burn this book right now. Renounce your disgusting faith and swear that Allah is the only God. If you do, perhaps we will spare your life. If not, we will hand you over to the Mutaween, and they will teach you the true meaning of pain before they execute you." I stood there, trembling, with Amal's hateful face on one side and her husband's icy face on the other. I could have lied. I could have saved my life with a few words. But in that moment, I thought of everything Jesus had suffered for me. I thought of how his words had given me life back when I was dead inside. A strength that was not my own filled my lungs. I looked the man directly in the eyes and, in a voice I barely recognized as mine, I said, "I cannot. This book and the God it speaks of have given me hope when I had nothing. Jesus is my Lord, and I cannot deny him." The reaction was immediate and brutal. Her husband hit me with a closed fist again and again until I fell to the floor, the taste of blood in my mouth. They dragged me down the stairs to the same dusty basement where I had found the Bible and threw me into a dark, airless storage room. They locked the heavy wooden door, plunging me into complete darkness. "You will rot here, infidel!" Amal shouted from the other side of the door. "We'll see how long your Jesus lasts." They left me there in the dark, without food and with only a small bottle of dirty water. The pain of the beating was sharp, but it was fear that threatened to consume me. In that suffocating blackness, with the stale air and the sound of rats scurrying nearby, I felt utterly alone. I cried and prayed. I was no longer asking to be rescued. My prayer was simpler. "Jesus, if this is the end, if I am going to die in this basement, please do not leave me. Give me the strength not to deny your name." Days passed. I don't know how many. I lost consciousness several times. The hunger was a constant ache, and the thirst a torture. My body was weak, but my spirit, strangely, felt at peace. In my lucid moments, I recited the verses I had memorized. I clung to the promise of rest for the burdened. On what I believe was the third night, as I lay on the concrete floor, resigned to my fate, something changed. A faint thread of light appeared under the door, followed by confused sounds coming from upstairs. Shouting, loud banging, men's voices I didn't recognize. Fear flooded me again. Had the Mutaween come for me? I huddled in the farthest corner, bracing for the worst. Suddenly, the lock on my door rattled with a loud crash. The heavy door burst open, flooding the room with blinding light. I covered my eyes. When my sight adjusted, I saw neither my captors nor the religious police. I saw several men in regular Saudi police uniforms. They looked at me with expressions of absolute astonishment and horror. One of them knelt beside me and spoke to me in soft Arabic. "Are you okay? Who are you?" As they helped me out of that dungeon, I realized what had happened. The commotion upstairs had nothing to do with me. It turned out that the husband, the powerful businessman, was involved in a massive network of financial fraud and corruption. The government had been secretly investigating him for months. That night, they had finally executed a raid on the house, arresting the entire family. My imprisonment was an unexpected discovery for them. My liberation was not an act of mercy from my captors. It was an act of God's sovereignty. Él no solo abrió la puerta de mi celda. Para rescatar a un solo esclavo olvidado, Él derribó toda la casa de sus opresores. En ese momento, comprendí que Dios no me había abandonado. Él había estado trabajando en la oscuridad, de maneras que yo no podía ver, para orquestar mi milagrosa liberación. They took me to a hospital, where they treated my injuries and severe dehydration. The Philippine embassy was notified, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, my story of slavery and abuse came to light. The process was long and complicated. I was transferred to a shelter for distressed Filipino workers, a place full of women with stories as harrowing as mine, or even worse. But in that shelter, I found something I had never had: community. Among the women, there was a small, secret group of Christians. We met at night in whispers, sharing a digital Bible on an old phone. We prayed together, cried together, and gave each other strength. That was my first church, a group of broken women who found their strength in Jesus in the land of their captivity. Months later, with the help of the embassy and various human rights organizations, I finally obtained my travel documents to return home. My former captors were facing long prison sentences for a long list of crimes, including fraud, corruption, and human trafficking. The day I boarded the plane back to Manila was the most surreal of my life. I clutched a new Bible, a gift from my sisters at the shelter, to my chest. As the plane took off, I looked out the window at the land that had been my prison for so long, and I wept. I wept for the lost years, for the pain suffered, but I also wept tears of a gratitude so immense I felt my heart might burst. Upon landing in Manila and seeing my family waiting for me, I could barely stand. My siblings, who were children when I left, were now adults with their own families. My parents had passed away years ago, waiting in vain for news of me. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with tears and hugs that carried the weight of 2 decades of separation. Life in the Philippines was not easy. I was a stranger in my own land. The world had changed, and so had I. But for the first time, I was the owner of my time, my decisions, my life. I had my freedom, and most importantly, I had Jesus. That faith, born in a dark closet and tested in a basement, became the rock upon which I rebuilt my life. I began to share my story, first with my neighbors, then in small local churches. My testimony was not one of hatred or vengeance, but of the incredible redemptive power of God. I started a small Bible study in my house, which slowly grew into a small congregation. I discovered that my purpose was not to forget the past, but to use it as a beacon of hope for others. I became an advocate for Filipino workers abroad, warning young women of the dangers and offering support to families whose loved ones are trapped in situations similar to mine. My life, once a story of slavery and hopelessness, is now a living testimony to the liberating love of Jesus Christ. Right now, wherever you are listening to this, I want you to know something. Maybe you are not physically locked in a basement, but you may feel trapped. Trapped by fear, by addiction, by depression, by hopelessness. You may feel that God has forgotten you. My story is proof that He has not. If God could hear the whisper of a forgotten slave in a basement in Saudi Arabia and tear down the walls of her prison, He can and wants to tear down any wall that is imprisoning you today. Jesus is still seeking the lost, healing the broken, and freeing the captives. Your miracle could be just around the corner. Thank you very much for joining me up to this point in my story. If my story has resonated with you, it is because, as I said, we have all been in a basement at some point in our lives, and I want to use these extra minutes to delve into the transformation that Jesus worked not only in my situation, but in my very identity. The miracle of inner transformation. When I was freed, I thought freedom was simply leaving Saudi Arabia. But upon returning to the Philippines, I realized that my body was free, but my soul was not entirely. I carried the invisible chains of nearly 2 decades of trauma with me. The silent nightmares. For months, I continued to sleep with the fear that someone would open the closet door. A slam made me jump. A shout took me back to a mall's kitchen. Physical freedom did not erase the body's memory or the soul's wounds. The struggle against hate. My biggest battle was not with loneliness or hunger, but with the resentment that grew like a weed in my heart. I asked myself, how can I forgive the people who stole my youth, who snatched away my chance to say goodbye to my parents? I was consumed by the desire for revenge. It was in this new struggle that I returned to the scriptures. I found Jesus not only as the liberator who opens prison doors, but as the healer of hearts. I read the story of the crucifixion and Jesus' words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I understood that forgiveness was not a gift I gave to my captors, but a gift I gave to myself. Resentment bound me to them. Forgiveness cut that tie. It was not easy. It was a daily process, a conscious choice to surrender my pain to God. But when I did, I felt the last, heaviest chain fall from my soul. My true liberation began with the act of forgiveness. A new purpose, from slave to advocate. By overcoming the trauma and resentment, God showed me that my years of suffering were not in vain. They had given me a unique voice, a moral authority that no one else could have. The legacy of my parents. The greatest sorrow of my return was not finding my parents, but I understood that the dream that led me to take that plane, the dream of providing for my family, had not died. It had simply grown. Now my family was all the young women who were about to take the same dangerous path as me. The house I built. I couldn't build my parents a house of cement, but God helped me build something much more enduring, a refuge of hope. I began working with a small NGO. My small home Bible study grew into a support network for families waiting for their loved ones and for women returning traumatized. We talk not just about my story, but about the story of the freedom that each of us can find. My life is no longer the story of a victim. It is the testimony of a survivor with purpose. My faith is not a tradition. It is the living evidence that God intervenes in human history, even in the darkest corners of the world. The final challenge. If you feel invisible at this moment in your life, if you believe that your circumstances are too great for God to change, Lena, the ex-slave from Saudi Arabia, tells you they are not. My life was a 2-decade nightmare that he turned into a pulpit. He took the trauma and transformed it into a ministry. He took my desolation and turned it into comfort for others. He can do the same for you, no matter what has chained you, whether it's the pain of the past, the fear of the future, or the lie that you are worthless. If you can whisper a prayer, if you can say, "Jesus, come to my basement," he will tear down the walls. He will come for you, not only to free you from your circumstances, but to free you from yourself, from hatred, from hopelessness. Freedom is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of Jesus in the midst of them. And that freedom, I promise you, is unbreakable. If this story has ignited a spark of hope in your heart, don't let it go out. I would love for you to join our community of faith and hope. Right now, wherever you are listening to this, I want you to know something. Maybe you are not physically locked in a basement, but you may feel trapped. Trapped by fear, by addiction, by depression, by hopelessness. You may feel that God has forgotten you. My story is proof that he has not. If God could hear the whisper of a forgotten slave in a basement in Saudi Arabia and tear down the walls of her prison, he can and wants to tear down any wall that is imprisoning you today. Jesus is still seeking the lost, healing the broken, and freeing the captives. Your miracle could be just around the corner. Subscribe if you believe God exists.